Hey guys, so I'm recording this voiceover. Apparently I forgot to record the audio when I was recording this lecture on Tuesday for the game metrics. So I'm just going to record over this. Hopefully it won't be too confusing. But yeah, so I'm getting started with the lab here. And in this lab, we used a bunch of scripts for the metrics. And so we need to download the assets folder if we don't have that. And then we're just getting started by going into our assets folder and getting all the scripts that start with metric at the beginning. So there's three different scripts: metric count, metric manager, and metric toggle. And those are the three scripts that we need to get our metrics display working for our UI. The metric manager just updates the metrics whenever something changes, and the count and the toggle are two different types of metrics. One is just for counting up, like if you're collecting items, and the other is for toggling something on and off. So we'll use that to display how many lives we have left. So I'm not really sure what I'm talking about at this point, but I think we're probably going to copy those scripts and put them in the game. And then open up Godot and get started building out that metric scene. So yeah, we're copying those scripts. And now probably going to go to the game folder and go into the scripts folder and then just paste all three of those in there. So you could also just drag and drop them in there. And now they're ready to go. If you need those, you can find them in the assets folder, which will be linked in the lab, which I'll link from this video. Okay, so now we're also looking at the sprites. And what we're going to be doing in this lab is using some sprites that we already created, our reward, which for me is like a little apple, and then the life, which is like a little heart. We're just going to be reusing those animations as icons in our UI display so that we don't have to create new art for that. But you could create new art if you wanted something smaller, or if you have like really detailed rewards or objects in your game and you need something simpler for the icon, you can use different sprites there. I'm just going to use the same sprites just to kind of save some time. And let's see, I'm opening up my Epic Pen tool, so I'm probably about to make a little bit of a drawing. And I think I'm about to explain how the metric scene works. The metric scene goes on top of the main game scene. And what we want is for it to always be displaying, so we don't want it to move with our camera. So if we have our main game window here with our player and some platforms and some stuff in the game window, so we want to have our metrics stick in the upper left-hand corner. They don't have to be the upper left-hand corner, but that's the way I'm going to set it up just for this demo. And so we want our metrics to always be there. And so in that case, we need to ignore the camera that follows the player around. And so we're going to put that in a separate UI layer. And we already actually have that UI layer in our scene. And so what we're going to do is create a separate metric scene on its own and then drop it into our levels. So I think I'm still explaining this, showing that the metrics window is going to be the same size as our main scene. And when we move the camera, the red part is not going to move. So we'll see the same display for the metrics. Okay, so we're getting started. I think I'm about to start creating the scene, and I'm going to use one of my green user interface nodes because it is a user interface scene. And so there's my main node, and you can see that it's going to default to be the same size as the game window. And I'm going to rename that main node metrics, and then I'm going to attach the metrics script. Or first, I'm going to save this scene as metrics.tscn in my scene folder. And I think I'm saying that I'm going to pin the metrics to the top left corner, and I could put it in the right or the bottom. Doesn't really matter where you put it, however you think looks best. A lot of games use different things for that. I'm going to use the top left corner just because it's kind of the simplest one to do. And here's the lab page with the instructions. So I'm just going to look through those and see how to create my different metrics that I'm going to add in here. So now I'm going to go ahead and add in the script. So I'm going to click on the script and go to load. And for the main node, I want to add the metrics manager script. And so that is going to have a list of all the metrics that are used in the scene. And what it's going to do is update those metrics whenever something changes in the global variables. So we can take a look at that script. It's actually quite short. The first thing that's happening here is I'm creating an array, which is like a list. And all of the paths to the metrics in the scene go in there. And then when the scene starts, I load all of those nodes. And then the last thing is just updating. So each one of my metric scripts is going to have a little function called update display. So whenever something changes, I'm just going to go through each one of my metrics and just update the display to match, the number of items or the number of lives or whatever else I want to represent with my metrics I'm going to put in there. So now I'm probably going to get started with the apple, which is my main item that my player collects. So I'm probably going to add a animated sprite to use as the icon for the apple, and I'm going to stick it in the top left corner. So here we go. I'm adding a child node. I'm going to add an animated sprite. And of course, I'm going to go ahead and name this item and set up the sprite frames. So I'll click on the sprite frames, click new sprite frames. And this is pretty easy. I'm just going to drop in my apple frames. I don't need more than one animation for this, so I'm just going to use this default animation. You could have more than one animation if you wanted to have like different types of items, or maybe something changes once you get to a certain number or something like that. But for this demo, I'm just going to have one animation. So I'm probably going to click on the waffle button under my animation frames toolbar and go into my sprites folder and grab my apple sprite sheet. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And this is 3 by 3. So I'm going to change this to 3 by 3. And I'm going to select the first 4 frames. And that's just going to create a little loop. And that'll be my apple icon. And you can see that by default, the apple is at this corner. And that works for our game. But for our metrics, that top left corner is actually going to get cut off by the scene window. The way it's set up, it's not centered like our game window is. So I'm going to have to move this over to be inside of the window. And let's turn on the playing so we can preview that first. And then we can see the metrics. The main node shows us what that window is. So let's just move the apple inside here. So I could just drag it in there and just line it up visually. Or I can go into my transform section in my inspector and set the X and Y values specifically. So I'm going to do 32 by 32, which should kind of nicely center the apple in that corner because it itself is 32 by 32. So I think that'll line up nicely. And so now I've got my apple icon. So this doesn't actually do anything. It just represents that this is the apple that the count is being set up for. So in a moment, I'm going to go in and add something to count how many apples I have. So not sure what I'm talking about here. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to add a label. And a label is a UI element that just displays some text. And the text that we'll display is just a number that represents the number of apples that we've collected as we're playing the game. And that's basically our score in the game. So there's my label. I'm going to rename this item count. And that's what I'm going to reference in my code. And so you can see the item count box here. We're going to put some text in there so we can see what that looks like. And you can see the default Godot text is kind of boring. It's just white, and it's this kind of default font that Godot uses. And so we're going to do a couple things here. The first thing we are going to do is add in a brand new font. And that's something that we kind of covered in more detail in the dialogue system lecture that we did. But for this one, I'm going to go over it again and do a slightly simpler version where we get a font and put it in here. But first I'm lining it up, so I'm going to put it in the same position as the apple, 32x, 32y, and then I'm just going to move it over a little bit so they're not overlapping. And I'm going to kind of try to line that up nicely. And the text draws from the top, and so I'm going to have to lower the y value as well to kind of move it up so that it's centered with the apple. I'll probably keep tweaking that until I get the right setup, and I'll probably also need to change it once I actually put the font in, so we'll probably see that in a second. So now I'm probably getting ready to change the font. Not really sure what I'm talking about here, but I'm getting ready to do the font. So I'm showing the fonts that we have used in the past, which was this last Priestess font that I changed into an NPC font and another font that's a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go and get another font file, a TTF or true type font file. So I'm going to go over to my browser, and I think I'm going to go to the Dialogic lesson to find a link to the font website that I use, which is Bint Font Maker 2. And so you can actually create a font on this website if you want to make your own font, but you can also download fonts that were created by other users. So I'm going to look through, and I found this nice pixel type font that I think will go along well with the game. And so I'm going to download that font, and then I just have to put it into my game folder so that I can load it into the game. So I'm going to open up my game folder and go to the font folder and drag my new font into that folder. And then I also want to save a reference to this font. This font is actually public domain, so I don't actually have to give attribution to this font, but it's nice to kind of remember where it came from in case I need to find it again in the future. And so I'm just going to write down the name of the font in my notebook and put the link to where I found it, and the license is public domain. So I'm also going to fonts.google.com just to demonstrate that you can get fonts from other places. So on Google Fonts, you can download a family, and that'll give you a little zip folder. And if you go in and open that zip folder, you'll see there's a true type font file. So you can use that just the same as with the Bit Font Maker. So there's all the true type font files. There's different ones for different styles, like bold and italic and stuff like that. So I didn't actually end up using this font, but this is just an example of another way that you can get fonts if you have other fonts that you want to use. So then going back to Godot, we have to install this font. So we can see it's in my folder now, and we can set it up. And so to install the font, I have to go to the theme override section. So you can create a theme in Godot to apply to all your different UI, which is probably a nice way to do it. But we're just working with a couple elements. So I'm just going to go to the theme overrides section and go into fonts. And so I want to turn the font on and create a new dynamic font. So dynamic font is like a true type font or something that can have different sizes. And so for this one, I want to choose the font data. So I'm going to load and go to my font folder and load in that new TTF that I have. And you can see it updates. So now we've got our nice new font, and it's a little bit small, so we can make it bigger. But we don't have to save this font because I'm only using it here. I'm not going to use it in a bunch of different places like I did with the dialogic setup. So I'm just going to increase the size of the font. You can see since it's a pixel font, at certain sizes, it gets kind of blurry. It's doing some anti-aliasing. And I don't think there's a way to fix that. I tried turning the filter on, but that actually does the opposite of what we want it to do. And so it doesn't actually look too bad when you see the little pixelation. But what I ended up doing is just making it pretty big so that on certain numbers, it looks more straight and flat. So 32, it looks okay. And now I'm just looking at the other menu items, not sure why. And now let's change the color. So let's go to colors and change the font color. And let's just match our apple color. So that'll look nice. And then we can center this a little bit more. And then one thing that I think I'm going to do in a second is put in a second number, because we're going to get to 10 apples probably pretty quickly. And so we want to make sure that that fits our layout. So I'm actually increasing the font size first. And I think I go all the way up to 48 to get back those straight lines. And then that actually looks pretty good. It's almost the same size as the apple. So I'm just going to leave that the way it is. And then I'm going to go, I guess I'm previewing it. Okay, and now I'm actually adding the script. So I'm clicking on the script and going to load, and this is a metric count. So it's just a number that displays whatever current number of items we have. And there's some code in the in that script that does that for us. So we just have to match the item name in our script variables to what the item is called in our global script. So that's really the only thing that you have to get here. And so if you have multiple items, you can have multiple different item names using this same script. So you can just attach the script and just change the script variable to whatever item name matches your global variables. So if you have multiple items, that's how you can do that. But for me, I only have one item that I'm counting, so I'm just going to stick with the default item count. And so that has to match what's in global because we reference the global script in order to display that data. And we can see that update display function that gets called by our metrics manager. And so this little script just gets attached to any one of the metrics that we want to display a count in our UI setup. So the next thing I'm going to do is add the life UIs. So I'm going to add 3 little heart animations and then use the metric toggle to toggle those on and off based on the number of lives the player has at any given time. So I'm probably still talking about this for some reason. Not really sure why. Oh, maybe here is where I'm going to add or change the number. So I'm kind of playing with the layout, and now I'm adding 10. So we are going to probably get above 2 digits. So we don't want the design to get messed up if we go, if we don't have space for that second digit. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm changing this to 10. That's a good default value for a 2-digit number. And then it'll get reset by our script. So we don't really even have to change it back to 0 because the script will set it once we start the game. Okay, so now let's add our life. So I'm going to go to Animated Sprite, call this life 1. And we're going to have 3 of these, and they'll toggle on and off depending on how many lives our character has. So this one is an animated sprite, and so I'm going to create some new sprite frames. And for this one, again, I'm just going to use the default. I don't really need to have multiple animations here unless you want to for some reason. And I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to set the vertical and horizontal to 3 by 3. And just grab those first 3 frames of my heart animation. And there we go. We've got our heart animation. And let's line this up next to our item count. So I just dragged it over, but then I'm going to change the Y to 32 just so I know that it's all nice and centered. And then maybe I'll play with the position a little bit. So that looks pretty good. And I'll turn in playing on so we get a little preview here. And then I'm going to duplicate this a couple times to add my second and third lives. But before that, I'm going to set up the script. So I'm going to go to the script, click on empty, go to load, and go to scripts and find my metric toggle script. And that's what I'm going to set up here. So the metric toggle script is similar to the metric count, except that we need to give it a value to check against to either toggle on or off. So we still have a name that needs to match the name of the value that we have in the global variables. But then we also have this value. So the default is 1, and it's basically going to check if the value of this metric is greater than or equal to 1, then it'll display this life. And so that way we can display multiple different lives, and then we can remove them if the player lives goes below a certain number. So the default is 1, and we'll just have to change it as we duplicate our lives. So I'm going to hit Command D or Control D to duplicate the life. So we have life 2, and I'll change the value to 2 and move it over on the X. So I moved it over to 152. That's not quite far enough. Let's try 162. That looks pretty good. And then we'll duplicate again. So I'll choose life 2, Control D, and change the value to 3. Oops. And then move this one over again. So I'll move this to 196. So now they're kind of evenly spaced out. And so now I have my 3 lives, and I think we're good to go. You can see the animations are playing at different times because they were on different frames, or they started on different frames when I started the playing preview. So if you want to fix that, you could leave it as is, but if you wanted to fix that, we could just go in and set the frame to 0 when the game starts. So we won't see this in the editor window, but we can set this up so that when the game starts, all of these will start at frame 0. The only thing there is that we have to actually change the node type to animated sprite so we can get access to that frame value, because a node doesn't have a frame, it's not an animation. So we can just change node, extends node to extends animated sprite, and then set frame to 0. So I didn't have that in my original code, but I think that could be useful. And I'll update that in the current version of the code that's on the GitHub. So the last thing I have to do before I throw this into my scenes is to actually put the metrics into my metric list. So I have the metric paths, and I just have to assign each one. It doesn't really matter what order you put them in. We just have to put each one of our metrics into there so that when we update something, it'll know where to look. So I'm just going to assign each one of those. If you have more metrics, just add more to the list. Just increase the size and then add more in there. So now I'm going to drop this into my levels. So I'll go to level 1. And so we have this UI canvas that already has our game over UI. And this is where we're going to also add in our metrics. So if you didn't have that UI canvas there, you would need to add a new canvas layer. So the canvas layer does not move with the camera that we have set to our main canvas. So our UI layer is for everything that we don't want to move with the camera. So I'm going to instance a child scene and find my metric scene. And this is going to look like, it's in it's not centered like our main scene because the camera is centered within the scene, but our metric scene is not centered. So that's okay if it looks like that. And when we play the game, it'll be in the right spot. So to hook everything up, we have to tell the scene manager where to find the metrics so that the scene manager can update the metrics. And so we have to add a little bit of code. This is actually in the assets version of this scene manager. So if you get the script from the assets, it'll already be in there. But if you've been following along with these videos, then it may not be there yet. So let's go ahead and open up the assets version of the scene manager and get the script for our metrics. So there's the metrics UI path, and we have to change things a little bit for the way that this particular game is set up because not every scene has all of the UI. So we can copy this and then make a couple of changes. So we have the metrics UI path, and then instead of automatically loading the metrics, let's just put this in our ready function and check to see that there is a UI path. So something has been entered here. And then if there is, that's when we can get the node for the metrics. So I'll just copy and paste this down here and remove the onReady from the main variable up here. And so now I have a reference for my metrics that will get updated in the ready function. So now I'm looking through the script to find the update. So anytime something changes in the game, we want to update our metrics. So if we get hit by an enemy or we collect an item, those are cases where we want to update our metrics. So I'm just going to grab that code. It's just metrics.updateDisplay, and that goes to our metrics manager, and that will go through all of our individual metrics and call that update display function. So I'll put this on in the on item collected. So that'll update display if we collect an item. And then I'll put the same thing in on player hit. And here I'm just saying if metrics because in this game, there's not always a metrics part depending on what scene you're in. So we just want to check and make sure the metrics exists before we try to update it. So let's connect the metrics to the scene manager, just fill in that metrics UI path. And then we can give it a test. And you can see when I get hit by one of the ice balls, I lose those life icons. So now I'm going to try getting one of those apples. So my item count is not counting. So let's see if I missed something there. So I'm going to go look at the item and look at the node tree. And I do have the signal for when I get the item, but I have not connected the item collected signal to the scene manager. So that's the part that I'm missing there. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to double click on the item collected and choose the scene manager and make sure it matches. And I have to check to make sure the receiver method is right. I think actually this is wrong. I think I changed this a little bit from what the default code is. Yeah, you can see that it didn't connect to my function that I already have, the on item collected. That's what Godot generated, so that's not the right one. So let's disconnect this and then reconnect it. So go to the scene manager and just connect. And if it connects to the function that already exists, that means that it worked. So you can see that green arrow is pointing to that function that is already there. So that worked. And so now I just have to do this same thing for all of my items, which is a little bit tedious, but I just need to connect them all. And that one was item 2. So I have to make sure the receiver method is always the same thing. So this part is a bit tricky, but I'm just going to delete the number from each one of the items to make sure that it connects to the right place. So now I want to make sure to connect the life, and this one says on life item connected, but it should also just be on item collected. So we just got to make sure that matches, and now we've connected the life item in my scene as well. So now we can see the items are counting up as I collect them. And so here I was having an issue because I couldn't click on my buttons in my game over scene. And this is because I had the metrics on top of the game over. So it was blocking that game over scene. So now what I'm doing is just moving the metrics section below the game over section, or really above the game over section in the scene hierarchy, but that way it will be layered below in the game. So I'll be able to click on the game over buttons this way. There's another way I can do this, which is just ignoring the mouse, which I can set on the metrics section if I want to leave that in that order. But the easier way to do it is just to put the metrics above the game over. I think what I'm doing here is trying to find the Z index, which actually doesn't exist for these items, but what they do have is this mouse filter. So I can tell it to ignore the mouse for the metrics. But again, it doesn't really matter if you have this set up. You can just put the metrics on top of the game over so that game over will be layered in front. So now you can see my buttons are working. I can restart the game or quit the game. So one thing that I may want to do is reset the player lives if I die. Right now, if I die, I'm going back into the game, but I don't have any lives. So we can go into where we're restarting the game and just set the player lives in the global variables back to 3. So now you can see my lives get set back to 3 if I restart the level. now I think I'm trying to actually beat the level, which is pretty challenging with these ice balls. Okay, so I made it to level 2. The metrics are not here because we haven't added the metrics into level 2. So that's the last little bit that we need to do. So I'm going to go to level 2 and open that up. And then I'll basically just go through the same process. So I'll go to my UI section and instance a child scene and add in my metrics scene here. And I'll move that below the game over and game win UI so that I can click on those buttons when they appear. Then I'll connect my scene manager to the metrics. And this code is already updated since they're using the same scripts. And then we're just gonna have to double check to make sure all of our items are connected to the scene manager. So we'll just go through the same process real quick of connecting all of our items to the scene manager. Okay, so I'm just making sure all of the receiver methods match and connecting everything. And now I should be able to play level 2 with my metrics working. So we see the item count working. And we can collect the rest of our items. And we can also try getting hurt to make sure that our life gets removed. And it looks like that works. Then we can get a life back. And then this is the end of the game. And I should probably add something in there so the player can't keep moving once we win the game. But for now, this is pretty good. So that's our metrics. Let me know if you guys have any questions. And hopefully this voiceover was not too out of sync.